The overhead fluorescent hum in the diner cut out for a second, leaving us in a heavy, grease-thickened silence that felt like a physical weight. I looked down at the coffee steam curling around the waitress's trembling hand as she leaned over, her voice a ghost of a sound against the roar of the rain outside. "Don't drink that, run now," she breathed, her eyes darting toward the back office where the shadows were too still. My hand stayed frozen on the ceramic mug, the heat seeping into my skin, while beside me, Bear, my German shepherd, let out a vibration so low it was more of a feeling than a sound, his hackles rising like a warning flag in the dim light. I didn't turn my head, but in the reflection of the darkened window, I saw the office door creak open and 3 men step out, their silhouettes blocking the only way back to my rig. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city and mile marker. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of mid-country deluge that turns the world into a grey blur and makes the asphalt of a truck stop feel like the edge of the earth. I'd pulled the Peterbilt into this gravel lot an hour ago, looking for nothing more than a lukewarm meal and a few hours of shut-eye before the haul to Denver. Bear had been restless the last 50 miles, pacing the narrow strip of the sleeper cab and huffing at the vents, his nose twitching at something I couldn't smell yet. I usually trust his gut more than my own, but the weather was turning foul, and the nearest alternative was 60 miles of winding mountain passes. When I stepped into the Lone Star Diner, the air hit me like a damp towel. It was empty, save for a young woman behind the counter whose name tag read Elena. She looked like she hadn't slept since the turn of the decade, her eyes wide and rimmed with a frantic kind of exhaustion. She didn't greet me. She just watched me walk to a stool, her knuckles white as she gripped a coffee pot. Bear sat at my heel, his weight pressing against my calf, a solid anchor of muscle and fur. He didn't lie down. He stayed on his haunches, his ears swiveling toward the back of the building. I ordered the midnight special and coffee, trying to keep my head down. I'm a man who likes his own company and doesn't go looking for trouble, mostly because I've seen enough of it in places the maps don't show. But the way Elena was moving, jerky, uncertain, like a bird trapped in a cage, made the hair on my arms stand up. As she poured the coffee, a drop splashed onto the counter, and I saw her hand was shaking so hard the liquid jumped. That's when she leaned in, under the pretense of wiping the spill, and gave me the warning. "Don't drink that. Run now," she whispered. I felt the shift in the room before I heard it. The back office door didn't just open, it swung wide with a confidence that felt like a threat. 3 men stepped out. The one in the lead was wearing a uniform that didn't fit quite right, a local deputy's shirt, but the boots were high-end tactical, and the way he carried his shoulders said he'd never spent a day in a police academy. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile a predator wears when it thinks it's already won. "Trouble with the brew, Elena?" he asked, his voice a smooth, oily drawl. He didn't look at her. He looked at me, his eyes raking over my worn canvas jacket and the grey at my temples. He saw an old trucker who'd stayed too long on the road. He didn't see the way Bear's lip curled back just enough to show an inch of white tooth. "Just a spill, Vance," she said, her voice cracking. Vance walked over, sliding onto the stool next to me. He was close enough that I could smell the stale tobacco and cheap cologne. "You're a long way from the interstate, friend," he said, tapping a heavy ring against the laminate counter. "We don't get many visitors on a night like this. Usually folks just pass through, fast as they can." I took a slow breath, feeling the old familiar tightness in my chest, the ghost of a world I'd tried to leave behind. I didn't want this. I just wanted to get back to the Peterbilt and drive. "Just looking for a meal," I said, my voice low and level. "Is that right?" Vance reached out, his hand moving toward my coffee cup. "Elena makes it strong. Maybe a bit too strong for an old man's heart." He tipped the cup toward me, an invitation that was actually a command. Behind him, the other two men moved to the ends of the counter, effectively boxing me in. They weren't just bullies, they were organized. One of them reached for the back of Bear's collar, a sneer on his face. That was the line. Bear didn't wait for a command. As the man's hand closed in, Bear exploded into a blur of black and tan, a guttural roar ripping from his throat as he lunged. He didn't bite, not yet, but the sheer force of 80 pounds of muscle hitting the man's chest sent him sprawling back into a table, the wood splintering under the impact. I didn't waste the second Bear gave me. As Vance turned his head toward the commotion, I moved. I didn't stand up, I surged. My left hand caught Vance's wrist, slamming it into the counter with a crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping, while my right elbow drove into his solar plexus. The air left him in a wheeze, and I followed through, grabbing his head and guiding it down into the very coffee he'd tried to force on me. The third man pulled a short, heavy club from his waistband, his face contorted in rage. He swung, but I was already moving, using Vance's staggering body as a shield. The club hit Vance's shoulder with a dull thud, and I stepped inside the man's reach, my palm striking his chin upward, snapping his head back. "Elena, get behind the counter!" I snapped, my voice cutting through the chaos. Vance was coughing, clawing at his eyes, the hot coffee and whatever they'd put in it burning him. He fumbled for a holster under his jacket, his movements frantic. I kicked his chair out from under him, sending him hard to the floor, and stepped over him to face the man Bear was pinning in the corner. "Stay down," I told the man on the floor, my voice like cold iron. Bear was standing over him, his muzzle inches from the man's throat, a low, continuous vibration rattling the air. The man froze, his hands up, eyes wide with the realization that the old trucker wasn't the victim they'd planned for. I turned back to Vance, who was trying to crawl toward the door. I reached down, grabbed his collar, and hauled him upright, shoving him into a chair. "Now," I said, leaning in until we were eye to eye, "why don't you tell me what's really going on in this diner?" Elena stepped out from behind the counter, her hands shaking, but her eyes starting to clear. She looked at the three men, then at me, then at the dashcam I'd unclipped from my rig and tucked into my pocket when I walked in, a habit I never broke. It was sitting on the counter now, its small red light blinking like a heartbeat, recording every bruised face and desperate breath in the room. "They're taking them," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "The girls, the travelers who don't have anyone looking for them. Vance and his crew, they pick them up, then they're gone." Vance tried to laugh, a wet, rattling sound. "You're crazy, girl. Who's going to believe you? A waitress and a grease monkey." He looked at me, a glimmer of the old arrogance returning. "You got nothing, old man. This is my town, my rules." I didn't say a word. I just reached over and turned the dashcam around so he could see the screen. It wasn't just recording the room. It was linked to the rig's external sensors, which had picked up the license plates of the blacked-out SUV idling in the shadows behind the diner. "Rules change," I said quietly. Bear suddenly turned his head toward the front door, his ears pricked. A series of heavy, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of air brakes releasing and heavy engines idling down in the parking lot. Vance's face went pale as the light from a dozen high beams cut through the rain, illuminating the diner like a stage. The light from the parking lot was blinding, a wall of white LEDs cutting through the grime on the diner windows. Vance squinted, his hand shielding his eyes as he tried to regain some semblance of the authority he'd walked in with. He didn't understand yet that the world had narrowed down to this one room, and he was no longer the one holding the deck. I felt Bear's weight shift beside me, his body vibrating with a low, focused energy as he watched the two men in the corner. The dog didn't need a command. He knew the temperature of the room had reached its boiling point. "You think some headlights are going to save you?" Vance spat, though his voice had lost its oily edge. He reached into his jacket again, but I was faster. I didn't just grab his arm. I used a pressure point I'd learned in a lifetime of places I don't talk about, forcing his hand to go limp and the compact 9mm to clatter onto the linoleum. I kicked the weapon across the floor toward Elena. "Pick it up," I told her, my voice steady, "and don't look away." One of the men in the corner, a bruiser with a jagged scar across his knuckles, saw his opening while I was focused on Vance. He lunged, a heavy glass sugar shaker gripped like a mace. I started to pivot, but Bear was already a streak of fury. He didn't go for a limb. He hit the man's center of mass with the force of a wrecking ball, his jaws snapping shut on the heavy denim of the man's sleeve and dragging him to the ground before the shaker could descend. The man shrieked as Bear pinned him, the dog's growl a primal warning that any further movement would be a mistake. "Call them off!" Vance yelled, his bravado finally cracking into pure panic. I ignored him, walking toward the front door and throwing it wide. The rain sprayed into the entryway, cooling the sweat on my face. Outside, the semi-trucks had formed a semicircle, their massive chrome grills like the teeth of some prehistoric beast. My brothers in arms, men I'd shared roads and coffee with for decades, stood by their cabs. They didn't shout. They didn't wave. They just stood there in the rain, a silent wall of denim and leather that told Vance exactly how small his town had just become. I stepped back inside and looked at Vance. "The dash cam in my rig isn't just recording the lot," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and showing him the live feed. "It's been streaming to a secure server for the last 20 minutes. Every word about the girls, every threat, and the fact that you're carrying a piece with a filed-off serial number." Vance's eyes darted to the phone, then to the men outside, then to Bear, who was still standing over his partner. The strategic situation had changed irreversibly. He tried to lung for the back door, a desperate attempt to reach the SUV in the shadows, but I stepped into his path. He swung a wild, panicked punch that I caught in my palm, twisting his wrist until he was forced to his knees. "You're not going anywhere," I whispered. Outside, the first strobe of blue and red appeared in the distance, reflecting off the wet pavement. These weren't Vance's local cronies. These were state troopers I'd alerted via the Brotherhood's radio frequency the moment Bear had started pacing in the cab. The third man, the one who had remained relatively quiet, suddenly bolted for the kitchen. I didn't have to say a word. Bear released the man on the floor and tore after him, his claws skidding on the tile for a fraction of a second before he found purchase. A moment later, there was a crash of pots and pans, followed by a sharp yelp of surrender. Bear emerged a few seconds later, nudging the man back into the dining area at the end of his teeth. I walked over to Elena, who was leaning against the counter, the color slowly returning to her face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a card with a number on it, a contact for a veterans outreach program that also handled victim advocacy. "They'll help you get out of this town," I said softly, my voice losing the hard edge I'd used on Vance. "And they'll make sure those girls find their way home." The front door swung open again, and a tall trooper stepped in, his eyes immediately landing on the scene, the broken furniture, the restrained men, and the dog sitting calmly by my side. He looked at me, then at the dash cam on the counter, then back at me. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Mercer?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded once. "We'll take it from here, Jack," he said, signaling his team to move in. As the troopers cuffed Vance and his crew, the silence that followed was different than the one before. It was a silence of resolution, not of fear. Bear walked over to Elena and rested his head on her knee for a brief second, a quiet gesture of comfort before returning to my heel. I picked up my cold coffee, took a single sip, and set it back down. Then I whistled softly for Bear and walked out into the rain. The diner was a swarm of motion, but my focus stayed locked on the back of the building. As the troopers began zip-tying the man Bear had pinned, I noticed the side door near the kitchen, the one leading to the shadowed alley, had been kicked ajar. I knew the count. There had been a driver in that blacked-out SUV, and he wasn't planning on waiting for a trial. "Bear, heel," I commanded, my voice low. We didn't wait for the troopers to coordinate. I stepped out the side exit into the freezing rain, the gravel crunching under my boots. The SUV's engine roared, its tires spinning and spitting mud as it tried to reverse out of the narrow space between the diner and a rusted storage shed. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy iron lug wrench from the bed of a nearby utility truck and stepped directly into the path of the vehicle. The driver saw me, a silhouette in the dark, and floored it, the grille of the SUV looming like a wall. I dived to the left, the side mirror clipping my shoulder with a jolt of white-hot pain, but as the vehicle surged past, I swung the wrench with everything I had into the driver's side window. The glass shattered into 1,000 diamonds. The driver, blinded by the spray of glass and the sudden intrusion of the cold air, jerked the wheel. The SUV slammed into the heavy steel dumpster at the end of the alley with a bone-jarring crunch. Before he could find his bearings, Bear was through the shattered window, his front paws on the doorframe, a terrifying roar echoing inside the cabin. I reached in, grabbed the driver by his tactical vest, and hauled him out through the broken glass. He was half my age and twice as panicked, clawing at my arms. I pinned him against the side of the crumpled vehicle, my forearm pressed against his throat. "The girls," I growled, the rain dripping off the brim of my hat and into his eyes. "Where are they?" He choked out a location, a derelict hunting cabin 3 miles up the service road. I didn't let go until a trooper reached us, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I handed the driver over like a sack of grain and turned back toward the diner, my shoulder throbbing in time with my heartbeat. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from terror to a grim sort of efficiency. Elena was talking to a female officer, her hands wrapped around a fresh, steaming mug of coffee that she actually intended to drink. She looked up as I walked back in, her eyes meeting mine. There was no need for words. The look of pure, unadulterated relief on her face was enough. Vance was being led out in front of his own town, his face pale and his head bowed. He walked past me, and for a second he stopped, his eyes filled with a desperate, dying embers of rage. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I just stood there, Bear at my side, 2 shadows that had proven to be much longer than he'd anticipated. I walked over to the counter and picked up my Dashcam. I checked the footage. Crystal clear. It showed the threats, the weapon, and the moment Bear had defended the line. I handed the memory card to the lead trooper, the one who had recognized me. "Everything you need is on there," I said. He took it with a respectful nod. "You always did have a knack for being in the wrong place at the right time, Mercer. Or maybe it's the other way around." I didn't answer. I just whistled for Bear and started toward the front door. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the familiar ache of a long haul and a hard fight. I had a schedule to keep, and the mountains didn't care about the justice served in a roadside diner. The rain had tapered off into a fine, cold mist that hung over the gravel lot like a shroud. I climbed back into the cab, the leather seat groaning under my weight as I sat there for a minute, just listening to the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. Bear jumped into the passenger seat, shaking the rain off his coat before settling down with a heavy sigh, his eyes never leaving mine until he was sure the adrenaline had cleared my system. I reached over and ruffled the thick fur behind his ears, a silent thank you for being the first to sense the rot hiding behind that counter. I watched through the side mirror as the sea of chrome shifted, my brothers in the other rigs slowly pulling out one by one, their tail lights disappearing into the mist like dying embers. They didn't need a speech or a handshake. We all knew the weight of what had almost happened in that back room. I glanced at the small photo of my daughter tucked into the corner of the sun visor, her smile a constant reminder of why I still bother to step in when the world tries to look the other way. The road ahead was a long, black ribbon winding into the heart of the mountains, and I shifted the Peterbilt into gear, feeling the familiar rumble of the engine vibrate through my boots. There's a specific kind of peace that comes after a storm, a quiet realization that while you can't fix everything, you can at least make sure one person sleeps a little easier tonight. I checked my mirrors. saw the Lone Star sign fading into a dim blur in the rear view, and pushed forward into the dark. I'm just a man with a truck and a dog, trying to mind my own business, but some lines aren't meant to be crossed. As the white lines began to flash by in a steady rhythm, I realized my coffee was long gone and my bones ached. But the weight on my chest felt just a little bit lighter. I didn't save the world tonight, but I saved a life, and in the end, that's the only haul that really matters. Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.